Well, I've painted several pictures in the past of windows and window boxes, doorways and so forth. I thought for this session I would paint a more or less derelict window. You can pick up all sorts of photographs on the internet, and I've got some of my own as well, of windows in old towns, from old derelict cottages and so forth. Windows of all sorts of shapes and sizes, and styles and so forth, some with Louvre shutters and so on, sort of French style. But the one I'm going to do for this exercise is a real old window with lots of old brickwork, stucco that's coming off the walls, windows which are obviously, or window frames which are obviously completely rotten and so on. And again, what I'm going to do here is show you how you can use tone, contrast, dark areas against light areas and so forth to make your painting look really three-dimensional. I see a lot of these sort of paintings and they are quite flat because the colours that have been used are not perhaps vibrant or toneful enough. There's plenty of opportunity here for shadows to come into play, reflections too perhaps off of the glass, and some nice vibrant colours that can come out, the oranges and yellows, and the brick red and so forth too. So it's a nice subject to paint. So you can see here I've got it drawn out in pencil. Again, I've drawn this a bit darker than I would normally, simply so that it shows up in the video. One or two dangers with windows and so forth is that it's very easy, if you're not careful, to make the windows too dark, the glass too dark, which sort of draws the eye in and makes the rest of the window look sort of flat. And also here you'll see that part of this pane, for instance, and just in this corner too perhaps, the window's been broken, and that is shown by the very dark marks. So if you make the rest of the window too dark, that won't show up. So you've got to be fairly careful how you do that. So it's drawn out. I've modified it slightly, removed some of the what's going on above the window and the building and so forth. I haven't painted, I haven't drawn, sorry, the details to the left hand side here. I'm just going for the window itself, and I've put in a bit more brickwork and so forth. So I've modified the picture quite considerably. I'm going to start with the basic woodwork, the rotten woodwork, and I'm going to use some burnt umber for that. It's quite grey, so I'm going to put on a very light tone to start off with. Burnt umber is nice, and so it's got a fair amount of red in it, and so it can be quite bright and warm, and we don't want that for the sort of the undercoat for the wood. So I've put in a little bit of Payne's grey into the burnt umber to grey and lighten it down a little bit. So it's very weak. I'm using paper which has got a bit of a tooth to it, in other words it's slightly rough, and so I'm going to take the opportunity there to brush over it with the brush quite flat, which means that I can leave some of the white of the paper simply caused by the roughness of the paper against the brush. So you can see that there'll be some of the white of the paper coming through. So we'll just go over all that sort of woodwork to start off with. So very light. where the plaster's come away from the wall. Got some of this wood coming through behind it. Okay. Now, whilst that's still wet, I'm going to mix up same two colours again, burnt umber and Payne's grey, but stickier, still on the brown side perhaps. So shadow mark coming down here, so I'm just going to bring that in. Paint's drying quite quickly, so I don't want too many hard edges there, so I just want to move that around a little bit. So you can see we're getting this sort of awful rough and rotten old woodwork. Okay. Some people might put in every little mark in the wood. I'm just trying to get an overall feel. So I'm not going to go and put in too much detail, just enough to make my wood look old and rough and rotten. You get these dark marks, especially in the corners. Maybe we've got a little bit too much blue in it. Add a little bit more brown to it. And that's really rotten. You can see by looking at the photograph that there's wood there that's very, very wet. Very, very rotten. You just get the feeling that if you ever try to open this window, it would fall apart. So I am dark at the moment, but I'm going to get darker later on with more detail work. Now the actual window itself, the woodwork around there, is just a little bit more brown. So just it's surprising how this bare wood is very, very light in places, so it's almost white in tone. And just move that paint around a bit, just to soften it. Change the tone, so I'm using some pure burnt umber here, which is nice, as you can see, nice and warm. Now that area there, which is a hollow if you like, is going to be very dark because it's in shadow, so keep the woodwork beside it fairly light so you get this nice contrast when it comes. So we'll put more detail into that later on. Of course, not forgetting the lath, because there's a lot of lath and plaster in these walls. It's down here, so you can see what I'm doing. I'm tending to put some of the tone on in places and then come back to it with a damp brush just to move it around a little bit. So using quite a small brush, and we've got this vertical timber coming down here. And this timber is a little bit more brown than blue, so I'll just add a little bit of pure burnt umber. So that's beginning now to look suitably awful. I have to say, I've done a lot of bodging of woodwork, windows and so forth, doors in old houses where we've lived. So I'm quite at home with this sort of thing. Now I'm going to use the same colours again, but even stickier and darker, to put some of the detail work in. And I'm going to use a finer brush, or a brush anyway that's got a nice point to it. I won't complete this stage at this moment in time. I won't complete the woodwork totally until later on when I've got some of the other details in. But I just want to establish some of the really dark marks. So we've got this sort of gap between the window and the side of the building there. So that's nice and dark. This is quite dark down here as well. More dark areas coming down. So you can see here I've got contrast between the very, very light, medium tone and now very dark. And this is what gives you the three-dimensional element. And when I see this sort of subject painted, very often, as I say, it often looks quite flat. And that's because very often the artist hasn't put enough contrast in. And where you've got the woodwork coming up against the concrete and the stucco and everything else, there'll be little dark areas there where there's sort of shadow. It's very important to pay attention to those areas. Hopefully that'll just start to become a bit more three-dimensional. Yeah, quite enjoy this. You've got some nice deep grooves, so the deeper the grooves, the darker the tone to use. And using a brush with a fine point like this for this sort of work is quite a delight. Generally speaking, a lot of the professional artists that I've spent time with use the biggest brush they can with a nice fine point, but they will not go down to a brush which is this fine, and I can understand why. It depends what sort of painting you want to do, but for this sort of work, certainly I find this sort of brush really nice to use. This is a Da Vinci Maestro brush. These are my favourite brushes. Because I use fairly rough paper, they do tend to wear fairly quickly. And they are expensive, but frankly, they have the best points that I've come across. I'm sure there's plenty of other brushes which are just as good. A lot of the rosemary brushes are excellent, but for pleasurable painting you need a pleasurable brush to use, and I've never ever been let down by Da Vinci Maestros. So I could go on doing this forever. I'm quite enjoying this. But you can see that what we're beginning to end up with now is a window frame which is becoming more and more three-dimensional, and above all else looking suitably awful and derelict. So where we've got this lathe work, a lot of darks in there where there's hidden shadows, hidden gaps. Makes you think that when the winter comes along and the winds blow, there will be an enormous number of cold rooms. Okay, now I'm not going to do much more than that for the moment on that woodwork. I'll come back to that later on when I do more of the detailed work on the brickwork and so on too. So what I'm doing at the moment is using a bit of Naples yellow over the areas which are concrete and plaster, just to give myself a base coat. And to give some of the wall some tone. Now, this concrete area over here, I think I'll use just a little drop of very, very light Payne's Grey, just to get that going. A little bit of that down here too, where there's obviously a lump of concrete. just hanging around. And we've got this sort of slightly orange plasterwork, so I'm just introducing a little bit of burnt sienna, and that's giving us a nice lovely warm colour, which contrasts with the cold of the wood frame and so on. So I'm working wet into wet. Varying the tone and the intensity. As I say, not going for every detail, just enough to give you a feel. And there will be little shadow marks here too, where the plasterwork has come away, and you've got concrete or something else or mortar beside it. There'll be shadows there too, so it's important later on we get those in. Again, that helps the whole thing look nice and three-dimensional. Okay. Just using very, very light Payne's grey again around those areas. And what I've forgotten here is the this brickwork on the right hand side of the window, again where some of the plaster work has fallen away. That needs some colour. I want the eye to be taken into the window itself, so I'm going to use less burnt umber on the outskirts. Make that slightly less intense, and that's just slightly colder. If I made the outsides too warm, too bright, the eye wouldn't know quite where to go. I've got some nice dirty marks here actually, so I can shove that in. That gives texture. One artist said to me, one professional artist said to me, that the most important colour that he or she used, the one that was most useful in his palette, was basically dirt. In other words, it was where a lot of his colours had mixed together and formed this sort of grey dirt colour, and that was very, very useful for to give texture and to give shape and so on too. So put that in there, put that down a little bit too. Okay. Now we've got this overhang here. Use some Naples yellow there. there's a dark patch where perhaps a piece of plywood or something has been shoved in to fill a gap. I'm only saying plywood because it's just the sort of thing that I used to do when trying to effect a temporary repair. A temporary repair which very often became more permanent than anything else. Now we've got this dark area in here. Just got to be careful there, not too sure. If I make it too dark, the eye will be taken to it. And I don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to, I think that's more than enough there. In fact, I think I might take some of that out a little bit. But then connect that to the rest of the side of the house by putting in these dark shadow marks. Back to that later on. Right. We've got what looks like a bit of lead work or whatever up here. So starting off with fairly thin Payne's grey. And then we'll add some texture to that, or shape if you like, with same colour mixed with burnt umber. The edges obviously been cut into this sort of V shape. So I'm going to add some of the brickwork now. The brickwork goes around the corner there, so around the corner it'll be slightly darker. So leaving the gaps for the mortar. I'm using burnt sienna here, and this is this lovely Winsor & Newton burnt sienna, which is absolutely gorgeous. I've said it often before, it's one of my most favourite colours. Now when I'm doing brickwork like this, just use a bit of ultramarine blue just to dirty it up a little bit. You often find with red brick that there's all sorts of other colours in there. Because it's going around a corner, this will be shaded in here, so whilst it's still wet, just running that colour down there. So this is light combination of burnt umber and Payne's grey. So we're close to finishing this now, really. I'm going to do the window panes. There are shadows and so forth up here that I need to do at the same time, but I'll get the panes done, start off with. Window panes, I do tend to use Payne's grey. And to start off with, I'm going to use quite a low tone, so quite a lot of water. I tend to use the side of the brush and leave areas which are still white, and you can see with this, because the paper has this tooth to it, in other words it's slightly rough, you get this slightly sparkled effect, which is a light shining off the glass. I'm not going to follow the photograph completely. There's obviously something leaning up against the window on the inside. I'm not going to worry about that. It's very difficult very often to do that sort of thing and make it look convincing. What you can do, just using the Payne's grey again, but slightly stickier this time. Just maybe too much. Yeah, it's too dark. Just take a tissue to that. Knock it back a little bit. blend it in slightly. I wanted to have a dark line, not throughout the entire corner, but just it helps give the pane a bit of shadow work in it. So just blend that in just slightly. It just helps the pane to look a bit more three-dimensional. I could have left a little bit more white. Some artists use ultramarine blue or a cobalt blue and a bit of burnt umber for their windows. It just comes down to preference basically at the end of the day, and just try to make them look convincing. Just a few more. I tend to use one colour, something like, as I say, Payne's Grey, and then just use little flicks of Payne's Grey again, but just a little bit more tone perhaps. That's okay. Now we've got this broken glass, and that's just going to be Payne's Grey, but a lot stickier. And if the glass has been too dark, sometimes you see people putting the glass in a very dark blue. If you did that here, you wouldn't get the effect of the hole. That's a bit too dark, that. So, in fact, I think what I might do is just drop in, because the glass is dirty, just drop in a bit of burnt umber here and there, just to dirty it up. Yeah, that's better. In fact, I think I might just do that. Because at the end of the day, these are old, dirty windows. So, we're getting quite close to being finished here, but what I need to do now is, with my fine brush, and mixing up burnt umber and a little bit of Payne's Grey. If you haven't got Payne's Grey, you can use either ultramarine or cobalt. Starting from the top, I'm just going to put in some shadow work. Don't be tempted to go around all these shapes completely, just do little bits of them where the shadow will fall. Brushing over the top there just to get a bit of texture going. And in some places the shadow where you've got the plasterwork coming away from the brickwork and the concrete and so forth, a little bit of shadow work around there. Stop and start. Don't make it too dark. Perhaps making it just slightly too dark at the moment. So I can just knock that back with a bit of water. And just continue doing that. There's a shadow where the lead flashing that they put on sticks out from the plaster work. There's a little bit of a shadow there. very careful to have to give the effect of just going round and round all the edges with dark. Just stop and start, put it here, put it here, put it there, don't put it over everything. That edge there needs work on it. And this will just help to make the whole thing look a little bit more real and three-dimensional. More cracks around here. And so I'll continue doing that over the whole painting, and then that'll be, I think, more or less complete. So that's us almost finished. It needs to be even more three-dimensional, and the way to do that is to add some overall shadow. The woodwork and the glazing here is set further back than this sort of brickwork here, and this leadwork here is further forward than that brickwork, and there's probably a bit of an overhang here where you've got the woodwork and then there's plasterwork down below, and so we need a bit of shadow in some of these areas. And the colour I tend to use for shadow I mix up, and I use quinacridone violet, a bit of burnt umber and a little bit of blue, very often cobalt blue, to make up a weak shadow colour. Now this is where you've got to sort of hold your breath, take your life in your hands, because by putting some of the shadow colour on, you're going to knock back some of the detail work you've perhaps put in, and a lot of people don't like doing that, so they don't do this. But I can assure you that when it is done, if it works, it'll enhance your painting. So I'm going to start off at the top, and you want to be quick, bold, and fairly decisive. So there's my shadow up there, and then across here and under there as well, and there'll be a bit of a ledge just here perhaps, so do the same there. It's a very light colour, but immediately it starts to make the thing look a little bit more three-dimensional. So that really is me finished with that. You'll see that I've added a bit of splatter just to liven it up a little bit. So my usual splatter colours are Designer's Gouache Permanent White by Winsor & Newton, Pyrrole Red by Daniel Smith, and Cobalt Teal Blue by Daniel Smith as well. Just a bit of splatter just to liven the thing up. The red helps to take the eye in and so forth. What I'll do now is I'll let that dry, and then if I need to I might just go back over some areas just to sharpen them back up again. Anyway, I've enjoyed doing that. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and good luck with your own artwork. Thank you.